Welcome to today's Gender Gap Science podcast with my brilliant co-host, where we believe that having honest dialogues about gender differences is empowering and avoiding this subject, well, obviously, disempowers.
Yes, obviously. You got it.
This is where we unravel some of the hidden, underlying differences between the sexes that are often unspoken, yet affect our lives or ones we know. If you feel you found value from today's show, give us a like. And if you want some additional scientific insights behind gender gaps, then subscribe too. Here we go. This is kind of surprising. Female perpetrated violence in intimate relationships with men. So we're going to be looking at this through a bunch of academic studies, really focusing on data, not stereotypes, ready to challenge some assumptions. Oh man, what controversy. So what does the research actually tell us? Is female perpetrated violence actually that common? It's certainly not something commonly thought of when we think of gender violence.
It's more common than you think. For example, there was a study done back in 2000 by Dasgupta and Koblenz. They were looking at dating violence among college students, and they found that both men and women reported experiencing physical violence at similar rates.
Similar rates? That's challenging like a widespread belief.
But wait, and it gets even more interesting? Believe it or not, men actually reported experiencing higher levels of moderate violence from their female partners than the other way around.
So, like pushing, shoving, throwing objects. That certainly falls into the category of violence on some level.
Things like that.
Okay, so women are throwing things, shoving, pushing men just as often, if not more. But you said this was moderate violence, right?
Yeah, it's important to note we're talking about moderate violence here. Severe violence, like beating or using a weapon, was less frequent in the study, which made gender comparisons difficult. But the data on moderate violence definitely, throws a wrench into some common myths about how rare female perpetrated violence against male partners is. It is not. A literature review, of research about female perpetrated violence was published in a peer-reviewed journal, Aggression and Violent Behavior, in 2006. According to studies, women initiated acts of violence in relationships at rates that are on par with or even higher than those of males. So this includes situations in which women commit acts of violence, no matter how severe, against male partners who do not engage in violent behavior. So in other words, the women were not being violent just out of self-defense in many cases, and in many cases the men would just take the abuse from the female partner and not defend himself. Male victims of this assault did in fact suffer injuries. Yes, it's true the men did get hurt. Honestly, the important point here is that women start physical fights with their partners at equal rates, or if not, then higher rates than men do. That certainly disputes the strong myth that men are the ones that typically start getting physically violent with their female partners, and not those women partners who start those fights with men. That fact alone, I'm sure, is going to surprise our listeners. And while stereotypes should be avoided, it's obvious that the stereotypical partner in mainstream media, or in our own ingrained beliefs, who is the one who starts to get physically aggressive with their partner, should not target male partners for that role.
And a sample of 6,900 university students, so in other words, a very large sample size here, from 17 Nations by Douglas and Strauss in 2003, showed that adolescent girls were 115% more likely to assault male partners than adolescent boys were to assault female partners. And this was regardless of whether assault or severe assault rates were considered. In another study with similar findings, Watson, Cascardi, Avery Leaf, and O'Leary in 2001 studied 475 high school students, 266 males and 209 females, from Long Island, and found female students had a significantly higher chance than male students to report an aggressive response.
The authors also mention, the very sharp rise in the number of female offenders in the criminal justice system. Women's incarceration rates are increasing at twice the pace of men's, according to the National Institute of Justice. That data is from around 2003 to 2004. We should check to see what it looks like today.
Speaking of the criminal justice system, since we are on the subject, how does it apply to when men commit acts of violence against female partners versus women doing the same against men if the act of violence is, let's say, similarly severe?
Well, so the authors of the same literature review examined findings about that. Here's something interesting about how the criminal justice system handles assaults by men and women when the severity is the same. If only the male partner was injured, the female was charged in about 60% of cases. But when it was the female partner who was injured, the male was charged 91% of the time. In situations where no one was injured, the male was still charged about 53% of the time, while the female was only charged in about 13% of cases. That data is from 2004.
This really highlights a noticeable difference in how the system responds based on gender, even when the circumstances of the assault are similar. I wonder why this is not widely known. In other words, we have discovered a new gender gap. But let's stay focused. So where do we go from here? If women are engaging in physical violence at these comparable rates, and with cases of moderate violence being at higher rates, what about other forms of abuse?
Let's see. A case study back in 1999 from the same large literature review showed that over a 13-week period, a Philadelphia emergency clinic discovered that about 13% of its male patients, out of 866 total, had experienced domestic abuse. 37% of these men reported a weapon being used against them, and nearly half, 47%, stated they had been kicked, bitten, punched, or strangled by a female partner. Even more startling is the fact that the figures may have been higher because significant trauma cases were not included.
Wow.
And incidents after midnight were not counted, which may have resulted in more injuries from female partners.
Okay, so we can go over more data, but I think we all get the point now that there is a disconnect between mainstream coverage and ideas about domestic violence in a unilateral way. What about emotional manipulation or controlling behavior? That is abuse too, right?
That's a really important aspect of this. There's a study by Swan and Snow in 2002 that really gets into it. See, they introduced the concept of coercive control, which involves tactics like isolating a partner from their support system, monitoring their every move, or controlling their finances.
Yeah, those are definitely forms of abuse. But I think we tend to picture men as the ones more likely to exert that kind of control, right? The controlling male partner denying his wife the right to work?
They can certainly be tools used by men or women, but we will get into that a little more.
Is the impact of violence truly gender neutral? Or are there differences in how men and women experience it?
Well, going back to that CAT study, they actually found that women's relationship satisfaction just plummeted after experiencing partner violence. And that was true no matter how committed they were to the relationship.
Sorry, go ahead. Okay, what I was gonna say was that for women, violence really damages how they feel about the relationship itself. What about men? Do they experience the same kind of negative impact?
Here's where the differences get pretty stark, according to the study. Men's relationship satisfaction remained largely unchanged even when they were the ones experiencing the violence.
Wow, that's a huge contrast. Why would women be so much more negatively affected by violence in a relationship? And why are men staying in relationships where they are being victims of this abuse? Maybe watching sports will numb the pain he gets from his abusive girlfriend.
I don't know about watching sports making his pain go away, but honestly, that's a question researchers are still kind of exploring. But it does suggest that violence might carry different meanings or implications depending on gender. It could be tied to social expectations around masculinity and femininity. Men may feel like they need to tolerate it, or even biological differences in how men and women respond to stress and trauma. Sure, it's complex. There's still a lot to unpack. However, it's important to add that there are some studies out there that do show a significant portion of male victims who have long-lasting trauma too. and the contrast is not as stark. So keep that in mind.
Okay, so we've seen that women perpetrate violence. The type of violence can be influenced by gender roles, and the impact of that violence is not necessarily the same for men and women. What other factors do we need to consider when looking at this issue?
Okay, here we go, people. We knew it was coming.
Oh no.
Childhood trauma. There was a study by Sullivan, Bybee, and Truman back in 2003, and they were exploring the link between childhood abuse, traumatization, and a greater likelihood of both perpetrating and experiencing violence in adult relationships.
So people who were abused as children are more likely to become both abusers and victims later in life.
Yeah, it highlights that cyclical nature of violence. The statistics from the study are pretty startling. Over half of the women they studied had experienced some form of abuse during childhood.
Over half, that's a huge number.
Data from 2003 from the Literature Review from Aggression and Violent Behavior found that the women who committed intimate partner violence against men had childhood experiences, exposure to interparental conflict, and history of mental health were demographically similar to those of the men who did the same thing. Oh yes, and it points to the concept of intergenerational transmission of violence. So if we can break that cycle, maybe we can start to reduce the overall prevalence of violence in society.
That makes a lot of sense. Childhood trauma is a predictor of violence in adult relationships. Everybody listening now is wondering, right, who suffers more, men or women?
It's a question researchers, are still trying to answer. Certainly the biological differences in how men and women respond to stress and trauma I mentioned earlier, and expectations of how men and women are allowed to express themselves when being abused.
Incredibly thought-provoking. Yikes. So many complexities of female-perpetrated violence.
Yep. So, societal biases that often prevent both male victims and female perpetrators from coming forward. This is where things get really interesting. It's amazing how deep these societal biases run. And sadly, but making it so hard for male victims and female perpetrators to come forward.
You're right. It's like there's this unspoken rule that men can't be victims and women can't be abusers. It makes it almost impossible to break free from those roles.
Swan and Snow's research from 2002 really shines a light on this. They share stories of women who used violence but felt completely justified because of their own past abuse. Or they saw themselves as strong women fighting back against a system that was oppressing them. And for men, the stigma of admitting they're victims of violence can be, even more intense. It challenges traditional notions of masculinity, leading to feelings of shame and emasculation.
So, if a man is being abused by his female partner, he's less likely to report it, less likely to get help, and more likely to be doubted or even ridiculed if he does come forward.
Unfortunately, that's often the case. These societal biases create this culture of silence, which makes it even harder to address and prevent intimate partner violence by women against male partners.
We've been talking a lot about physical violence, but what about the emotional and psychological aspects of abuse? Are there gender differences in how those manifest?
That's a crucial area to explore, and the research by Katz, Kufel, and Koblenz in 2000 kind of suggests that there might be. They actually encourage more research on psychological abuse, which includes things like verbal attacks, humiliation, constant criticism.
I could see how psychological abuse could have a significant impact on relationship satisfaction, maybe even more so than physical violence in some cases.
And they point out that we know very little about how psychological abuse affects dating relationships, especially among younger couples. More research is definitely needed to understand the frequency, the consequences, and any potential gender differences in how it's both perpetrated and experienced.
And if we connect this back to the Sullivan study we talked about earlier, could childhood trauma play a role in how people engage in or respond to psychological abuse as adults?
That's a great question. It's definitely possible that those childhood experiences of emotional abuse or neglect could shape them, making them more vulnerable to both perpetrating and experiencing psychological abuse.
It's not just about physical violence. Yeah, definitely. We need to understand the whole spectrum of abuse, how it's influenced by gender norms, and how those individual experiences like childhood trauma play a role.
Of course, and speaking of individual experiences, let's shift gears for a moment and talk about arrests. This one was conducted by Aaron Soft and Vivian in 2003, and it looked specifically at women who were arrested for domestic violence.
Women being arrested for domestic violence? We touched on it some.
Yeah.
That seems to contradict the idea that women are always the victims.
It does, doesn't it? So, that's precisely why this study is so important. It challenges our assumptions and makes us confront the reality that women can be perpetrators of violence too against male partners.
So, what did they find? Why were these women being arrested? What's going on?
Well, the study found that women were being arrested for domestic violence in increasing numbers, and this was a direct result of mandatory arrest laws. These laws were put in place to protect victims, but they sometimes end up with both parties being arrested, even if one person was acting in self-defense. It is an incidental effect where, because of mandatory arrest laws, women started actually getting arrested more for domestic violence. Previously, many female perpetrators of this type of violence were not arrested and thus created the false narrative or illusion that women don't commit domestic violence. Studies show that male victims were upset in that prior era, obviously when they were victims and she was never arrested.
That's a really complicated situation. On the one hand, we don't want to minimize or dismiss women's violence. But on the other, we have to acknowledge that it often happens in the context of self-defense or retaliation against male violence.
Well, that's where things get really tricky. How do we tease apart those situations? How do we ensure that victims, regardless of gender, are protected while also holding perpetrators accountable?
It seems like a very nuanced and delicate balance to strike.
It is. And this is where the need for specialized training and careful assessment comes in law enforcement.
So we can't just rely on that simple he said, she said approach anymore. You mentioned earlier that we'd be discussing those societal biases that prevent both male victims and female perpetrators from coming forward. Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
This is where the work of Hines and Saudino in 2003 becomes really relevant. They found that there are these distinct gender differences in aggression, with men being more likely to engage in physical aggression and women more likely to use indirect or relational aggression.
What do you mean by indirect or relational aggression?
It's a form of aggression that's more covert. It focuses on damaging relationships or social status. So this could involve things like spreading rumors, gossiping social exclusion, or manipulating relationships. We spoke about this a little bit earlier regarding psychological, manipulative, and emotional abuse.
So it's less about physical harm and more about emotional or social damage, according to this study, that these women resort to in order to abuse their male partners?
Uh-huh. And this is where the societal biases come in. Because women are stereotyped as being less aggressive, their acts of indirect aggression are often downplayed or dismissed. People don't take it seriously if they are committing this type of abuse against a male partner, like they would physical aggression. However, this type of abuse, especially if committed continuously, can be deeply traumatizing for a significant other. It should be part of the discourse of domestic violence.
So a woman spreading false and socially excluding or outcasting rumors about her boyfriend, leading to his public humiliation and isolation from his peers, would not be considered as harmful as a man who slapped his girlfriend, even though both actions can have devastating consequences.
And on the flip side, you see men who are victims of indirect aggression might not be taken seriously because their experiences don't fit that traditional narrative of male victimization. They can be ridiculed or told to ignore their feelings, be a man, and ignore their circumstances as a result of suffering from their female partner's indirect aggression.
We have these preconceived notions of what abuse looks like, and if someone's experience doesn't fit that mold, it's easily dismissed or minimized.
This can have serious consequences for both male victims and female perpetrators. Male victims might be less likely to report abuse or seek help, and female perpetrators might not be held accountable for their actions, in which case they may feel that they did nothing wrong to their male partners because he doesn't have any physical bruises, just emotional distress. I mean, after all, if nobody calls these women out or points out that what they are doing is wrong and absent any consequences for them, then why would these women think what they are doing to their male partners is a form of abuse?
It really highlights the importance of understanding the different forms that abuse can take and challenging those ingrained biases that prevent us from seeing the full picture. Because we are raised to think abuse can only be physical.
Another study that contributes to this conversation is the one by Moffat, Caspi, and Rudder from 2001, which focuses on antisocial behavior in children. They found that childhood aggression is a really strong predictor of later violence and criminal behavior, and that this link is particularly strong for boys.
So, if a boy is aggressive in childhood, he's more likely to engage in violence as an adult.
That's what the research suggests, yeah. And this finding has some important implications for understanding female perpetrated violence.
How so?
Well, if we consider the fact that girls are generally less physically aggressive than boys, it might explain why we see those lower rates of very severe physical violence perpetrated by women in intimate relationships.
That makes sense. If girls are less likely to engage in physical aggression during childhood, they might be less likely to carry those patterns of behavior into adulthood.
But it's important to remember that this doesn't mean that women are incapable of violence, or that their violence is any less harmful, or that they are not capable of committing severe or moderate violence, as we spoke of earlier. It simply suggests that their aggression might manifest in different ways to include emotional and indirect aggression against their male partners.
So we need to be aware of that full spectrum of aggressive behavior, both physical and indirect. Of course, this data also means we should try to discourage unhealthy aggressive behavior in boys. As a culture, perhaps another podcast on that one. That's a huge problem.
Yes, that's true.
Yes, we have to avoid simplistic narratives that we are used to believing in. It's the 21st century.
It certainly is. We have to get used to the undeniable fact of recognizing that women can be both victims and perpetrators of intimate partner violence. No easy answers. But wait, there's more. What's the underlying issue? We spoke about childhood trauma, but what is driving these women to commit these acts of violence? So, women who have been arrested for domestic violence are often put into a BIP.
BIP? Oh, got it. BIP, like a big igloo prison?
Yeah, no, don't repeat that. So, a BIP is a behavior intervention plan so that they can get to the root cause behind their pattern of violent behavior. So, a 2004 and 2005 studies by Carney and Buttell, mentioned in the literature review, point out that these women, not unlike men who commit these same types of gender violence, by the way, suffer from attachment disorders. These are linked to childhood attachment patterns that led into adulthood where these women became, in one way or another, overly dependent on their male partners due to insecurities. This is interpersonal dependency at elevated levels.
So, do these big igloo prisons, BIPs help these women become better? Are they effective in changing this behavior and improving their self-esteem?
Yes, the treatment plan does show that women improve significantly from these attachment disorders and can better their quality of life. In the final part of our podcast, we're going to be looking at another obvious yet important solution to this problem. Since we are talking about treating this problem, one study that adds another layer is by Capaldi and Crosby from 2003. They looked at the role of relationship dynamics in intimate partner violence. They found that couples with poor communication skills and high levels of conflict were more prone to violence regardless of gender.
So it's not just individual factors like childhood trauma or societal biases, but how couples actually interact with each other.
Yep. The way couples communicate, so important, and not well communicated about, right? How couples resolve conflicts and even how they manage their emotions can either create a breeding ground for violence or foster a safe and respectful environment.
That makes sense. If you're constantly arguing or struggling to communicate, it's easy to see how things could escalate. They eventually will.
This highlights the need to equip couples with healthy communication skills and conflict resolution strategies. These are essential tools that can help prevent violence before it even starts.
Giving couples the skills to create a safe and respectful dynamic from the get-go.
Speaking of prevention, there's a study by Fauci, Bauman, and Ennett from 1998 that offers some valuable insights. They looked at the role of peer influences in dating violence among adolescents, and they found that teenagers who had friends, who either condone or engaged in violence were more likely to experience it themselves.
So, our social circles and the attitudes of our peers can actually influence our own behavior in relationships.
Definitely, especially during adolescence, who we hang out with, who we choose to date. Our cliques and groups can heavily influence our own choices and actions. That's when we're still figuring out who we are and what we believe in. This is also true of perpetrators of domestic violence.
This suggests that prevention involves broader social networks and peer groups.
It's about fostering a culture where violence is simply not tolerated or condoned. And that starts with educating young people about healthy relationships, who they choose as their friends, who they date, which circles they socialize in. Parents, you have been warned.
We've explored different forms of abuse, the societal biases that often silence victims, that contribute to female perpetrated violence. Then it seems like we've only just begun. So is there anything else you want to leave our listeners with before we wrap up?
Just a reminder, we only touched on a few studies, but there are many more that examine these complexities from different angles.
That's a great point. For those interested in learning more, what resources would you recommend?
Well, some of the studies we discussed today are a great starting point. Let's see. I'll mention some here. You've got Physical Violence in Adolescent Romantic Relationships, Prevalence, Risk Factors, and Consequences by Katz, Kufal, and Koblenz in the Journal of Adolescent Research. Then there's The Number of Women Arrested for Intimate Partner Violence has increased significantly since the advent of mandatory arrest laws by Aaron Soft and Vivian in Violence Against Women. Don't forget Coercive Control and Partner Relationships. Understanding the Gendered Nature of Intimate Terrorism by Swan and Snow in the Journal of Aggression, Maltreatment, and Trauma, and the Public Health Significance of Intimate Partner Violence Against Men, Prevalence, Correlates, and Consequences by Hines and Saldino in Partner Abuse. Of course, you can't leave out Childhood Abuse, Adult Attachment, and Relationship Satisfaction by Sullivan, Bybee, and Truman in Personality and Individual Differences. Finally, there's Psychiatric Outcomes of Partner Abuse, results from a 20-year longitudinal study by Aaron Saft, Moffitt, and Caspi in the Archives of General Psychiatry and Antisocial Behavior in Children and Adolescents. We touched on a developmental analysis by Moffitt, Caspi, and Rudder in Developmental Psychopathology.
Our conversation today about intimate partner violence, particularly female perpetration, has been cool. Well, not cool for victims of violence. Cool in that we can have a discussion about this. It's challenged my own assumptions, I'm sure many of us have, about the existence of male victims and female perpetrators of domestic violence. Yes, it's real, folks. No joke.
And that's precisely what we aimed for. Let's face it, most of us believe that nobody deserves to be a victim of violence. The gender of the perpetrators and victims shouldn't matter.
Thank you for guiding us through this challenging conversation. I encourage our listeners to continue learning about this.
This isn't a battle between genders. Remember, women and men, different but equal, let's bridge the gender gaps through these conversations instead of building walls by shutting down discourse about gender gaps. Right? Am I right?
Yes, right.
Okay, everybody. We'd love to hear your comments below. And of course, stay tuned for more on different types of our favorite subject. Gender gaps